Hi viewers, this is Muhammad Hamza Suhail and I'll be your instructor for today. We are about to discuss a very significant topic in the field of finance and managerial accounting, and this topic is known as the break-even analysis or the CVP analysis. As a background, this is a short-term decision-making technique which enables and helps the organizations to understand or to calculate that how much units do they need to sell in order to make a desired profit or to at least achieve the break even. Break even means a situation where there is no profit, no loss to the organization. An organization is selling this much units that is helping it to cover all of its costs, but no profit. And yes, you have guessed it quite correctly that we are talking about the situation of normal profit in a perfectly competitive environment, a concept we studied earlier in economics. So, how does all this happen? Let us dive together in the ocean of break even analysis. So, talking about the CVP, so CVP is basically an abbreviation for cost, V stands for volume, and P stands for profit. We know that there is a strong relationship between the production volume, which is produced, and the cost which is spent on producing that production volume. And we know that once this production volume is sold at any particular selling price, so the difference between the selling price and the cost of that profit gives us, the cost of that product gives us what we call profit. All right. And if you're talking about the costs, so there are different kinds of costs associated with production. Some of the costs are fixed in nature, and other costs are variable in nature. And we know that in response to the change in the production volume, these costs show different kinds of behavior. Like if you talk about the fixed costs in total, so the total fixed costs remain fixed, remain unchanged within the relevant range, no matter what the production level is. But if we talk about the fixed cost per unit, so the fixed cost per unit declines with the incline in the production level or in the level of activity and vice versa. And if you talk about the variable costs, so the variable cost in total, they increase with the increase in the level of activity and decrease with the decrease in the level of activity. But if we talk about the variable costs per unit, so they always remain the same no matter what the level of activity is. All right. So there is a relationship we know between the cost and volume and profit. If the production volume increases, so we know that the fixed cost will remain fixed and the variable cost, I'm right now talking about the total cost structure, right? So the variable cost in total will increase. But if we are analyzing the situation uh, on a per unit basis, so the selling price minus the variable cost per unit, which will remain fixed in that case, and talking about the fixed cost per unit, which will decline in this case. So we know that the cost structure will change, and this will definitely impact the profitability once the products are sold. So in order to understand these things further, in order to understand this relationship further, what do we need? We need to understand more about variable costing because we know that whenever we are talking about any decision making technique, so the operating profits are not much relevant to us. Rather, we are more interested in another concept which we have studied in marginal costing. And yes, you have guessed it correctly. We are talking about no other but the contribution margin. So, what the contribution margin is, it's a very important concept, and you can say that this is the foundation stone for the break-even analysis. So if we talk about marginal income statement, so first of all, we have the selling price or the revenue, and from that selling price, we deduct all the variable costs. Selling price minus variable costs give us what we know as contribution or the contribution margin. This is also a kind of profit, but this is such kind of profit which is used to cover all the fixed costs. Means that the contribution margin contributes in covering the fixed costs of an organization. And once all the fixed costs of an organization are covered, what happens? The same contribution then moves towards the profitability of the organization. And if there is a situation, if there is a scenario that the contribution margin is not sufficient to cover the fixed cost of the organization, then the organization will be having a loss. And on what thing does it depends that the contribution will be sufficient or not to cover the fixed cost in total? So this is basically the sale volume of the organization, that how much units does it sell and how much revenue is it collecting in total and how much total fixed cost of that organization are. So in order to avoid loss or to make a desired profit, the organization needs to know that how much sale volume does it needs to sell. Now you guys might be thinking that sale volume is not the only thing that the organization needs to consider. It is also possible that the selling price changes. It is also possible that the production cost changes. So guys, since we are talking about short-term decision making, so we need to take a few important assumptions. And what those assumptions are, let me take you guys to my PowerPoint slide. So guys, I hope that you are watching my screen. So there are a list of few assumptions that we take while studying the CVP analysis. The very first assumption is that all costs, either fixed or variable, there is no concept of mixed cost when we are studying the CVP analysis. The second thing is that within the relevant range, the total costs and revenues are predictable with a linear functional relationship to output. The third thing being that the total fixed costs, the selling price per unit, variable cost per unit, and the selling mix remain constant over the relevant range. The fourth assumption being that production is equal to sales, which means there is no changes in the inventory. And number fifth, the time value of money is ignored. Now you guys must be thinking that we have taken the reality out of the scenario. So actually, you know that whenever we are studying anything, like if I give you the examples of school physics that we studied, what was the major assumption? There is no friction, there is no air resistance. Now, do you think that this is even practical? Of course not. But definitely we need to take a few assumptions if we have to understand other things. So we are not talking about anything being frictionless. We are talking about something that is quite justified in the short term. Like if we talk about the total costs being fixed, so this doesn't mean that the variable cost is not existing over here. This means that the variable cost per unit, which is defined, will not change, and the total fixed cost, they will also not change. Likewise, the selling price will also not change. Now, how is this possible? For example, we are the manufacturing company and we have made a catalog of all our products. All our selling prices are mentioned on that catalog, and we have spread the catalog to our customers or maybe uploaded it to our website. So now we are not in a position to change that price. However, we can offer discounts, but we are not taking those into consideration while studying the CVP. Likewise, the cost can remain fixed if we have certain agreements signed with our contractors, with our suppliers. And this means that in the short run, those prices will not be changing. So in order to understand CVP analysis, we have to take these assumptions quite seriously. Okay. So having talked all about this and having understood the concept of contribution, there is one more thing that we need to discuss, and I would like to share a numerical example with you guys. So let us take the example of Carl Company. Carl Company sells its products for $100 per unit. Fixed costs are $120,000 and the variable cost is $60 per unit. The unit contribution margin is $40 per unit. As you can see, the difference of $100, which is the selling price, and $60, which is the variable cost per unit. This is the contribution to the coverage of fixed costs made by the sale of each unit. And the following example, as you guys can see, shows that how the contribution margin increases as sales volume increases and more of the fixed costs are recovered and operating income goes from negative to positive. Now you can see that when the sales volume was 1000, so we had a total sales revenue of $100,000 and the variable costs were a total of $60,000, resulting in the contribution margin, a total contribution margin of $40,000, whereas the total fixed cost of the organization are $120,000. What do we have? A loss of $80,000 because the contribution was not significant enough or was not sufficient enough to cover all those fixed costs of the organization. However, when we increase the sale volume, what happened? The contribution per unit started to, sorry, the total contribution started to increase. And this increase led to a time when from bearing loss, we started to make a profit. And when did this happen? So you can see that when we started to sell 3,000 units, so there was a situation where there was no profit and no loss. Reason being that the contribution we were making from our sales, this contribution was equal to the fixed cost of our organization, and we were earning only to that extent that all our costs are being covered now. Means we are earning at 120,000 after cutting or deducting the variable cost, and the total fixed costs are equal to $120,000. So this means that we will not be taking anything else into our pocket, but thankfully we are also not bearing any loss because whatever costs we have spent, we are at least recovering that money. All right. But the time or moment we increased our production from 3000 units to 4000, even if you had sold 3001 unit, even then you would have resulted into a profit because the break even point was achieved. So this is also something to understand that whenever break even point is achieved, any unit you sell after that will result into your profits. So now, how will we calculate break even? Will we always like do all this complex calculation at every particular sale volume and then assess whether this sale volume will result into break even or not? Definitely no. So in order to make your lives easier, I'll be sharing a formula with you guys, which is basically the crux of the CVP analysis. And that formula will help you calculate the break even point. And with that formula, you will also be able to calculate any amount of sales that you will make, which will help you earn a desired profit. Okay. Before that, let us see how break-even point can be presented on the graph. So we are plotting an XY graph, as you guys can see, with revenues and costs on the Y-axis and number of units along the X-axis. And here comes the fixed cost line. Now this is horizontal because we know that the fixed costs are fixed no matter what the level of activity is within the relevant range. So this is why this is a horizontal line. And it is also not starting from the origin because we know that the fixed cost is independent of the level of activity. Even if there is no level of activity, fixed cost will be there. For example, the factory rent will be there. But if there is the activity level is at its peak, even then the fixed cost will be there. So this is the reason why the fixed cost line or the fixed cost curve, whatever you call it, it does not start from the origin. Here comes the variable cost line, and we know that the variable cost is always there because there is the level of activity. No level of activity, no variable cost at all. If there is level of activity, variable cost will be there as it is. This is why this variable cost curve or variable cost line always starts from the origin and it is usually upward sloping. And what happens next? This comes the total cost line. And I think that you guys will understand that why the total cost line is not starting from the origin. Rather, it is starting from the point where the fixed cost and the fixed cost is basically starting. So I think that this is already self-explanatory. This is the total revenue line, and we also know that revenue increases with the increase in the activity level. So this is why, as you can see, that the revenue curve is also an upward sloping curve. So now, what is the break-even point? The point where the total revenue curve intersects with the total cost curve. That point is basically the break-even point, and this is how it is represented on a graph paper. So guys, I hope that now you guys have started to develop an understanding of the overall theme of what we are talking about. Like we are first of all trying to find out that point where we are able to sell at least as much units that can help us recover our total cost or fixed cost, like if I can say. And once our fixed costs are covered, which means that our total cost is covered, then any single unit we sell beyond that point, that will result in profitability. So now this is the time that I now teach you what is the formula to calculate the break even point. So guys, this is a very simple formula. As you guys can see, we just need to divide the total fixed cost by the unit contribution margin, and the concept behind this formula is the same. Contribution per unit means that it is the contribution which each unit is contributing to cover the total fixed cost. So if the contribution per unit is, let's suppose, $40, and the total fixed cost is of $120,000, so this means that every unit is contributing $40 to cover the whole bunch of $120,000. So how many contribution per unit will be required in order to like pay back this total fixed cost? So this is simple. Divide the total fixed cost with the unit contribution margin, and this will give us the total number of units that need to be sold in order to cover up the total fixed cost of the organization. And let's suppose if we are interested in finding what do we say, the break-even point in revenue. So for this purpose, we have another important formula, and that formula, I think I was not able to tell you guys about the revise the concept of contribution to sales ratio. So if contribution per unit is divided by the selling price per unit, or the total contribution, which I'm abbreviating over here as T cont, is divided by the total sales, which I'm abbreviating over here as T dot sales. So this will give us a ratio which is called the contribution to sales ratio, and we can always give it as a give it a nickname of CS ratio. Okay, so going back to our slide, if we need to calculate the break-even point in revenue, what we simply need to do is we need to divide the fixed cost by the contribution margin ratio, which is also known as the contribution to sales ratio, and this will give us the break-even point in dollar amounts. So now we have another example. Ray Company, which is a manufacturer of cell phones, sells them to wireless service providers for $60 each, which is the selling price. Ray Company's variable cost is $35 per phone. Now we need to calculate the break-even point in units. So we know that the contribution margin, how do we calculate it? Sale minus the variable cost per unit. So $60 minus $35 will give us $25 per unit as a contribution. And now the total fixed cost is $150,000. This is the additional information you can find in the third line after the contribution calculation. So provided that $150,000 is the total fixed cost, so we divide it by $25, and this will give us 6,000 units. So now if you want to prove it, so the proof you can see in the last paragraph of this slide. Uh, if you multiply the total 6,000 units by the selling price, and then you multiply it also by the variable cost, and then you subtract the total fixed cost from all this, the difference and the sums and the products. So you will find that we have nothing remaining with us, means a situation of no profit, no loss. But a sincere suggestion to you guys that please do not try to prove it in the exam, because you will have a very limited time, and just trust your mathematical calculation and your memory. If you are using the correct formula and the correct figures from the question for which you should be mindful of, then please trust your calculations and everything would be fine. All right. And now the same example using the contribution to sales ratio, which can also be proved again, as you guys can see. I just want you guys to focus on the screen. So we can also calculate the break-even point in revenue, means the dollar amount, which you can see is being calculated as $360,000. All right. So this is how we calculate break-even point in units and in dollar amounts. Okay. So we can also relate it again. So there is another example. Given a selling price of $4 and variable cost of $2.2, what is the break-even point in units if fixed costs are 4,600? So now we have a selling price of $4 and variable cost of $2.2. So this means that we have a contribution margin of $1.8 per unit, and the total fixed costs are $4,600. So now $4,600 divided by 1.8 will give us 2,555 units. So we round it off to 2,556 units, because you know that we cannot have number of units as a continuous quantity. It should always be a discrete, okay, discrete quantity. And if you want to calculate the revenue, so now we have two options. So either you multiply 2,556 by the selling price, which is $4, you'll get the dollar amount, or the second option is that you divide the fixed cost by the contribution margin ratio, and the quotient will be the same answer. Okay, so this is what break-even analysis is all about. So to summing up in a nutshell, how the break-even point or the break-even analysis is used for decision making. So there are different uses. The very first use, which I told you in the beginning of this small session, was that how many units we need to sell in order to like make a desired profit. And let's suppose if an organization is making a specific expense, so how much units do we expect to sell after that expense, for example, advertisement expense, so that that particular expenditure is justified. Break-even point is used to make such sorts of decision making. And secondly, we can also use break-even analysis as a what-if analysis to assess that what will be the impact if we change the prices, if we change the costs, although the assumptions say that the cost will not be changed. But we can only make changes to the cost if we are using break-even analysis as a what-if analysis. This means that in any particular analysis, we will not be changing the cost, but we can make a different break-even model for different cost structures in order to make a comparison, in order to see that what will happen if such variables are changed. So we had limited time, and there is a lot more to discuss in the break-even analysis. For example, the multi-product break-even analysis, how to calculate the desired profit. But because the time is quite limited, so I hope to meet you guys in some other sitting, some other day, some other time, and hope to discuss this topic more. Thank you so much.